Marcus Kane had built his empire on fear, on silence, on the absolute certainty that nothing happened in his world without his knowledge and control. His estate in Greenwich, Connecticut was a fortress of white columns and perfectly manicured hedges, a monument to the power he had accumulated over 20 years of ruthless ambition. When his black SUV pulled into the driveway 3 hours earlier than expected, he was ready to catch whoever had been stealing from the kitchen accounts, ready to fire the staff member who had been making unauthorized phone calls from the house line. What he was not ready for was what he actually found. His son, 5-year-old Theo, stood on the front pathway with his little blue crutches, watching intently as the new housekeeper knelt in the dirt, her pristine blue uniform now stained with mud, drawing something on the ground with her finger. Marcus froze. His hands went to his head in disbelief. Because his son, the boy who hadn't spoken a word in 2 years, the child who flinched at every touch and trusted no one since his mother's death, was laughing. Actually laughing. And Marcus Kane, the man who controlled half of New York's underground, had no idea what to do with that. If you're ready for this story, type in the comments where you're watching from. Marcus Kane had been born into violence and had refined it into an art form. His father had been a street-level enforcer in Brooklyn, the kind of man who solved problems with his fists and never asked questions about the bodies he left behind. His mother had disappeared when he was 4, leaving nothing but a photograph and a gold locket that Marcus still wore under his shirt, hidden from the world like every other vulnerability he possessed. He had clawed his way up from those Brooklyn streets with a combination of intelligence, brutality, and an instinct for survival that bordered on supernatural. By 25, he had his own crew. By 30, he controlled the docks. By 35, he had expanded into real estate, construction, and the kind of legitimate businesses that made it impossible for the FBI to touch him without bringing down half the city's economy with him. The estate in Greenwich had been his reward to himself, a symbol of how far he had come from the cockroach-infested apartment where he had grown up. 12,000 square feet of Georgian architecture, set on 15 acres of manicured grounds, with a staff of 8 and security systems that would make the Pentagon jealous. It was beautiful and cold and exactly what Marcus had always imagined success would look like. And then Victoria had come into his life. She had been a gallery owner in Soho, completely outside his world, the kind of woman who wore flowing dresses and spoke about art with a passion that Marcus found simultaneously baffling and intoxicating. She had seen something in him that no one else had ever bothered to look for, a capacity for tenderness that he had buried so deep he had forgotten it existed. They had married after a whirlwind courtship, and for 3 years, Marcus had experienced something he had never expected to feel: happiness. Theo had been born on a spring morning, tiny and perfect, with his mother's blue eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Marcus had held his son for the first time and felt something crack open in his chest, a love so fierce and unexpected that it terrified him more than any rival ever had. He had sworn in that moment that Theo would have everything he had never had: safety, stability, a father who was present and protective, a childhood untouched by the darkness that Marcus navigated every day. For 3 years, he had kept that promise. And then Victoria had died. The car accident had been ruled just that, an accident, a drunk driver running a red light on a rainy November evening. But Marcus had never believed in coincidences, and he had spent the 2 years since her death hunting for evidence that someone had targeted his wife, that her death had been a message meant for him. He had found nothing, which somehow made it worse. If it had been murder, he could have avenged her. If it was truly an accident, then the universe was simply cruel, and there was no one to punish for the hole that had been torn in his life. Theo had been in the car that night. He had survived with minor physical injuries, a broken leg that had healed, and a concussion that the doctors said would leave no lasting damage. But something else had broken inside the boy, something that no doctor could fix. He had stopped speaking the day of the accident and had not uttered a word since. He flinched when people tried to touch him, even Marcus, especially Marcus. He spent his days in silent solitude, playing alone with blocks and cars, never looking anyone in the eye, never responding to the parade of therapists and specialists that Marcus had brought in from every corner of the world. The physical disability had come later, a condition in his legs that the doctors said was psychosomatic, his body manifesting a trauma that his mind couldn't process. He needed crutches to walk now, small blue ones that matched his eyes, and Marcus hated the sight of them with a fury that surprised even him. Not because he was ashamed of his son, never that, but because they were a constant reminder of his failure. He was the most powerful man in 3 states, and he couldn't fix his own child. The staff at the estate walked on eggshells around both of them. Marcus knew he had become impossible to work for, demanding and critical and prone to firing people for the smallest infractions. 3 housekeepers had quit in the past year alone, unable to handle the tension that permeated the house like a poisonous fog. The latest had left just a month ago, claiming that the atmosphere was affecting her mental health, and Marcus had let her go without argument, because he knew she was right. The new housekeeper had started 2 weeks ago. Her name was Elena, and she had come with impeccable references from a placement agency that specialized in high-security households. Marcus had barely looked at her during the interview, had delegated the hiring to his head of household staff, and had ignored her existence ever since. She was just another employee, another person who would eventually leave when the darkness of this house became too much to bear, or so he had thought. Elena Vasquez had learned to be invisible long before she started working in the homes of the wealthy and powerful. Growing up as the eldest of 7 children in a small town in New Mexico, she had mastered the art of moving through spaces without being noticed, of anticipating needs before they were expressed, of making herself useful in ways that people took for granted until she was gone. She had been a nurse before she became a housekeeper, trained at a county hospital where they saw everything from gunshot wounds to overdoses to the quiet devastation of families falling apart. She had been good at her job, perhaps too good because she had burned out after 8 years, unable to separate herself from the pain she witnessed every day. A therapist had suggested she needed a career that was less emotionally demanding, and somehow she had ended up in domestic service, trading the chaos of the emergency room for the controlled environments of wealthy households. The irony was not lost on her. These homes, for all their beauty and order, were often just as broken as the families she had seen in the ER. The rich had their own kinds of wounds, their own ways of bleeding out while pretending everything was fine. Elena had learned to recognize the signs, the forced smiles, the children who were too quiet, the marriages that existed only on paper. She cleaned their houses and kept their secrets, and tried not to care too much about the damage she could see but couldn't fix. The Kane estate had felt different from the moment she arrived. The other staff members had warned her about the boss, told her to stay out of his way, to do her job quickly and quietly and never ever disturb the child. They spoke of Theo in hushed tones, as if he were made of glass, as if looking at him too directly might shatter whatever fragile equilibrium he had achieved. Elena had nodded and listened and filed away every piece of information they gave her. And then she had done what she always did. She had watched. She watched Marcus Kane leave for the city every morning at 6, his jaw tight and his eyes empty. A man going through the motions of life without actually living it. She watched him return every evening at 9 or 10, often later, disappearing into his study with a bottle of whiskey and emerging only when the house was dark and everyone else was asleep. She watched the way he looked at Theo's closed door, the longing and the fear and the helplessness that he probably thought no one could see. And she watched Theo. The boy was a ghost in his own home, drifting from room to room with his little blue crutches, never making eye contact, never responding to anyone who spoke to him. The other staff members had given up trying to engage him, treating him with a distant kindness that felt more like resignation than care. But Elena saw something they had all missed. She saw the way Theo's eyes followed her when she was working, curious despite himself. She saw the way he lingered near doorways when she was in a room, not entering but not leaving either, as if he wanted to be closer but didn't know how. She saw the intelligence behind his silence, the awareness that he had retreated from the world but hadn't stopped observing it. On her 4th day, she had started talking to him, not asking questions, not demanding responses, just talking. She narrated her work as she did it, explaining why she was dusting this shelf or washing that window, chattering about nothing and everything in a steady, soothing stream that expected nothing in return. The other staff had thought she was crazy. Elena had ignored them. On her 7th day, Theo had moved closer. Not much, just a few feet, but enough that Elena noticed. She kept talking, kept working, kept pretending that his presence was the most natural thing in the world. That night she had cried in her small room in the staff quarters, not from sadness but from something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or the weight of responsibility that comes with being trusted by someone who has forgotten how to trust. On her 10th day, she had started drawing. It had begun accidentally, a moment when she was kneeling on the garden path, pulling weeds that had sprouted between the stones. Theo had been watching from the grass, and Elena had picked up a stick and drawn a simple picture in the dirt. Fair sun with rays spreading out in all directions. She had looked up at Theo and smiled, then gone back to her weeding. When she looked again, he had moved closer. Close enough to see the drawing clearly. And for the first time since she had arrived, she had seen something that looked like interest in his eyes. The next day she drew a house. The day after that, a tree. Each time, Theo moved a little closer, his crutches making soft sounds on the stone path. His blue eyes fixed on whatever image was appearing in the dirt. Elena never pushed, never asked him to participate, never made a big deal out of his proximity. She just drew and talked and waited. Today was supposed to be like every other day. She had been kneeling on the path, drawing an elephant, because she had overheard one of the staff mention that Theo used to love elephants before the accident. She had been so focused on getting the trunk right that she hadn't heard the car pull up. And then a shadow had fallen over her, and she had looked up to see Marcus Kane standing there, his hands on his head, staring at his son with an expression that Elena had never seen on anyone's face before. It was the expression of a man watching a miracle happen and not knowing if he was allowed to believe in it. Marcus couldn't move. He stood there on his own driveway, the gravel still crunching under the tires of his departing SUV, and he couldn't make his body do anything but stare. Theo was close to someone, not just in the same room, not just tolerating their presence, but actually close. He was standing less than 2 feet from the housekeeper, Elena, leaning forward on his crutches to see what she was drawing, his whole body angled toward her in a way that Marcus had not seen in 2 years. His son, who flinched at shadows, who retreated to the far side of any room that contained another person, was practically touching this woman. And he was making sounds. Not words, not yet, but sounds. Little hums and clicks that Marcus remembered from before the accident. The noises Theo used to make when he was concentrating on something that interested him. The therapists had called it vocal stimming, had said it was a sign of engagement, and Marcus had not heard it since the night Victoria died. The housekeeper looked up at him, and Marcus saw several things flash across her face in quick succession. Surprise because he was home early. Concern because she was covered in dirt and clearly not doing what she had been hired to do. And then something else. Something that looked almost like defiance, as if she was daring him to criticize her for whatever this was. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out. He tried again, and the words that emerged were not the ones he had intended. He asked what she was doing. It was a stupid question. He could see what she was doing. She was kneeling in the dirt on his pristine pathway, ruining her uniform and probably the stone underneath, drawing pictures for his son like some kind of street artist, instead of the highly paid domestic professional he had hired her to be. He should have been furious. He should have fired her on the spot. Instead, he just stood there, his hands still on his head, waiting for an answer that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Elena stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. She didn't apologize, didn't make excuses, didn't look away from his eyes. She simply said that she was drawing elephants because she had heard that Theo liked elephants, and that she had discovered he seemed to enjoy watching her draw. The simplicity of the statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. Theo liked elephants, past tense, before. A fact from another lifetime. From the days when Theo spoke and laughed and asked his father to take him to the zoo so he could see the elephants spray water from their trunks. Marcus had forgotten that detail, buried it with so many other memories that were too painful to access. He looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit. Theo was watching him now, those blue eyes that were so like Victoria's fixed on his face, with an expression that was not quite fear, but not quite trust either. He was waiting, Marcus realized, waiting to see what his father would do, waiting to see if this small precious thing that Elena had built with him would be destroyed. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for 2 years beginning to thaw. He lowered his hands from his head. He took a breath, and then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked if he could see the elephant. Elena's eyebrows rose slightly, but she stepped aside without comment, gesturing toward the drawing in the dirt. Marcus walked forward, aware that every step brought him closer to Theo, aware that his son's body was tensing slightly as he approached. He stopped a few feet away, giving Theo space, and looked down at the ground. The elephant was surprisingly good, detailed and proportioned correctly, with a raised trunk and large ears that fanned out like wings. Elena had drawn it with her finger, and the lines were imprecise but full of life, the kind of drawing that captured the essence of a thing rather than its exact appearance. Marcus said it was a good elephant. His voice came out rough, unused to speaking about anything that wasn't business or orders or the cold practicalities of his life. He said that Victoria, that Theo's mother, used to take him to the Bronx Zoo to see the elephants. He said that the elephants there had names, and that Victoria had made up stories about their adventures, silly stories that made Theo giggle until he couldn't breathe. He hadn't meant to say any of that. The words had come out on their own, pulled from some deep place that he had tried to seal shut, but that apparently still existed. He looked up from the drawing and found Elena watching him, with an expression he couldn't read, and Theo watching him with something that might have been recognition, as if the mention of his mother's name had connected to something inside him that was still alive. For a long moment no one moved. The afternoon sun beat down on the pathway, casting shadows from the sculpted hedges, turning the white columns of the house into gleaming monuments.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
A bird sang somewhere in the garden, oblivious to the significance of what was happening on this ordinary Tuesday in this extraordinary house. Then Theo took a step forward, a small step, hesitant, his crutches making soft sounds on the stone. He looked at Elena as if asking permission, and she gave him a small nod. And then he looked at the dirt beside the elephant, the empty space where nothing had been drawn yet, and he pointed. He pointed at the ground, and then at his father, and then at the ground again. Marcus felt his throat close up. His son was asking him to draw something, his silent, traumatized son, who hadn't voluntarily communicated with anyone in 2 years, was asking his father to join in. Elena seemed to understand before Marcus did. She knelt back down, picked up the stick she had been using and held it out to him. Her eyes were gentle but serious, and she said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. She said that he should draw something that made Theo happy. That was all he had to do. Just draw something that made his son happy. Marcus took the stick. It felt ridiculous in his hand, a small insignificant thing compared to the power he usually wielded, the documents he signed that moved millions of dollars, the orders he gave that changed lives. But Theo was waiting, and Elena was waiting, and Marcus realized that this moment mattered more than any deal he had ever closed. He knelt down in the dirt beside Elena. Ignoring the damage to his $1,000 shoes and his tailored pants, he looked at the elephant she had drawn, and he tried to think of what to add. His mind, usually so quick and sharp, went completely blank. He couldn't draw. He had never been able to draw. Even as a child, his art projects had been disasters that his teachers diplomatically called creative interpretations. But Theo was watching, and the expression on his face was something Marcus hadn't seen in so long that it took him a moment to recognize it. Hope. His son was looking at him with hope. Marcus pressed the stick into the dirt and started to draw. He made a circle, then 2 smaller circles above it, then 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a smile. It was supposed to be a face, Victoria's face, but it looked more like a deranged pumpkin. He felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment, felt the familiar frustration rising in his chest, the knowledge that he was failing at something that should be simple. But when he looked up, Theo was smiling. Not laughing at him, but smiling with him, recognizing the effort even if the result was terrible. And Marcus felt something break open inside him, some wall that he had built between himself and his son coming down in pieces. He drew another shape, this one meant to be himself, equally terrible. And then, his hand trembling slightly, he drew a smaller figure between the two faces. A child. Their child. Their family, or what was left of it, rendered in crude dirt drawings that a toddler could have done better. Elena was quiet beside him, giving them space, but Marcus could feel her presence like a warm light at the edge of his vision. She had done this. Somehow this woman he had barely acknowledged had found a way to reach his son when all the expensive specialists had failed. She had used nothing but patience and kindness, and elephants drawn in dirt, and she had accomplished what felt like the impossible. Theo moved closer, closer than he had been to anyone since Victoria died. He stood right next to Marcus, so close that his father could smell the shampoo in his hair and feel the warmth of his small body. And then he did something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. He reached out and touched the drawing. Not the elephant, not the terrible faces. He touched the small figure that Marcus had drawn to represent him, the child between the two parents. He traced it with his finger, slowly, deliberately, and then he looked up at his father with those blue eyes that held so much pain and so much courage. And he spoke. It was one word, the first word he had uttered in 2 years, and it came out raspy and uncertain and absolutely perfect. He said, "Daddy." Marcus caught his son as his own legs gave out, sinking to his knees in the dirt beside the drawings, pulling Theo gently into his arms. He was crying, he realized, great silent tears that he couldn't have stopped if he wanted to. Theo was crying too, his small body shaking with the force of emotions that had been trapped inside him for far too long. Elena stepped back, giving them privacy, but Marcus caught her hand before she could retreat completely. He looked up at her through his tears and saw that she was crying too, this woman he barely knew, who had done what no one else could do. He thanked her. Just 2 words, but he meant them more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Elena squeezed his hand and then let go. She said that he should stay with his son, that she would make sure no one disturbed them. And then she walked back toward the house, her blue uniform dirty and her shoes covered in mud, looking like an angel in disguise. Marcus held Theo for a long time, there on the pathway beside their terrible drawings and Elena's beautiful elephant. His son didn't speak again that day, but he stayed close, letting his father hold him, occasionally touching the drawings in the dirt as if they were sacred objects. By the time the sun began to set, turning the white columns of the house to gold, Marcus knew that everything had changed. The question now was what he would do about it. The breakthrough with Theo was not a magic cure. Marcus learned that quickly, painfully, in the days and weeks that followed. His son still struggled, still had moments of retreat and silence, still flinched sometimes when people moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. But something had shifted. Some door that had been locked tight had cracked open, and through it came small, precious signs of progress. Theo started speaking again, slowly at first, single words and short phrases that felt like gifts every time he uttered them. He asked for things instead of pointing. He said goodnight to his father, usually, when the words would come. He called for Elena when she was in another room, something that made her eyes fill with tears every time it happened. Marcus restructured his entire life around these moments. He started coming home earlier, delegating work that he once would have insisted on handling personally. He cut back on the aspects of his business that required late nights and long absences, shocking his associates who had never known him to prioritize anything over the empire he had built. When they asked what had changed, he simply said that he had found something more important. They didn't understand, but they didn't argue. Elena became a fixture in their lives in ways that went far beyond her job description. She was officially still the housekeeper, but she spent more time with Theo than she did cleaning, and Marcus not only allowed it, but encouraged it. He raised her salary without being asked and gave her a room in the main house instead of the staff quarters. When she protested that it wasn't appropriate, he told her that nothing about their situation was appropriate, and that he had stopped caring about what looked right the moment his son said his first word in 2 years. The other staff members watched the transformation with a mixture of confusion and hope. They had served in this house of shadows for so long that light felt almost uncomfortable, But they adapted, as people do when given the chance to witness something beautiful. The head of security, a former Marine named John, who had been with Marcus for a decade, actually smiled one morning when he saw Theo walking across the lawn with Elena, the boy's laughter carrying on the wind. Marcus watched them too from his study window, from the doorway of the kitchen, from wherever he happened to be when they passed by. He watched the way Elena knelt to listen when Theo had something to say, the way she never rushed him or finished his sentences, the way she celebrated each small victory as if it were the greatest achievement in the world. He watched the way his son looked at her, with a trust that Marcus had thought he would never see directed at anyone again, and he watched himself watching, and he tried to understand what he was feeling. It had been so long since he had felt anything beyond anger and grief and the cold satisfaction of power. The business of survival had consumed him, first as a boy on the streets of Brooklyn, then as a man building an empire, then as a father trying to protect his son from a world that had already hurt him so badly. He had forgotten that there were other emotions, softer ones that didn't require walls and weapons to sustain. He was falling in love with Elena. He realized it gradually, then all at once, the way such realizations tend to happen. It wasn't just gratitude for what she had done for Theo, though that was certainly part of it. It was her. The way she moved through the world with such quiet competence, the way she saw things that others missed, the way she had looked at him that first day, not with fear or calculation, but with something that might have been understanding. He didn't know what to do with these feelings. Romance was not his area of expertise. The women in his past had been attracted to his power, and he had been attracted to their willingness to accept the darkness that came with it. Victoria had been different, had seen something else in him, but Victoria was gone, and the idea of loving someone again felt like a betrayal, even as it felt like salvation. Elena seemed unaware of his struggle, or perhaps she was simply too professional to acknowledge it. She continued her work, continued her sessions with Theo, continued to bring light into a house that had known only shadows. If she felt anything for Marcus beyond respect, and perhaps a cautious friendship, she never showed it. But Marcus noticed the way she looked at him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching. He noticed the way her cheeks flushed slightly when their hands accidentally touched. He noticed the way she lingered at the door of his study when she brought him coffee, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. He noticed, and he waited, and he tried to figure out what came next. 3 months after that afternoon on the pathway, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He gathered his senior associates in the conference room of his Manhattan office and told them that he was stepping back. Not out, not completely, but back. He would retain ownership and strategic oversight, but the day-to-day operations would be delegated to a committee of people he had trained for exactly this purpose. The reaction was predictable. Shock, confusion, thinly veiled attempts to grab at the power he was releasing. Marcus handled it all with the calm authority he had always wielded, making it clear that this was not a retreat or a weakness, but a choice. He had built this empire, and now he was choosing to live a different life. Anyone who couldn't accept that was welcome to leave, with his blessing and a generous severance. Most stayed. They had worked with Marcus long enough to know that when he made a decision, arguing was pointless, and some of them, the ones who had families of their own, seemed to understand what he was doing, even if they would never have had the courage to do it themselves. He drove back to Greenwich that evening with a lightness in his chest that he barely recognized. For the first time in 20 years, he had nowhere he needed to be, nothing he needed to do, no one depending on him for anything except his presence. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Elena was in the garden when he arrived, sitting on a bench while Theo played on the lawn nearby. The boy was attempting to kick a ball, his crutches propped against the bench, his legs unsteady, but determined. He fell more than he succeeded, but he kept trying, and every time he made contact with the ball he let out a sound of triumph that made Elena's face light up with joy. Marcus stopped at the edge of the garden and watched them for a moment. The evening light was golden, painting everything with warmth, and he felt something settle inside him, a peace that he had not known was possible. Elena looked up and saw him. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and something shifted in the air between them. She knew. He could see it in her face. She knew what he felt, and she was waiting to see what he would do about it. He walked across the lawn to where she sat, watching Theo kick the ball one more time before collapsing onto the grass in a heap of giggles. His son looked up at him and smiled, that precious smile that had been absent for so long, and said a word that he had started using only recently. He said, "Daddy," and then he said, "Watch." And then he got up on his unsteady legs and kicked the ball again, harder than before, sending it rolling halfway across the lawn. Marcus applauded, genuinely impressed, and told Theo that he was going to be a soccer star someday. The boy beamed and went chasing after the ball, his progress slow but determined, leaving Marcus and Elena alone on the bench. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Theo, and then Marcus spoke. He said that he had made some changes at work, that he would be home more now, that he wanted to be present for Theo in ways that he hadn't been since Victoria died. Elena nodded, her eyes still on the boy. She said that was good, that Theo needed his father, that no one could replace that presence in his life. Marcus took a breath. What he said next was the hardest thing he had ever said, harder than any threat he had ever issued or any deal he had ever closed. He said that he wanted her to stay, not just as a housekeeper, not just as someone who helped with Theo, but as something more. He said that he knew it was complicated, that their positions made it awkward, that she had every right to say no. But he couldn't pretend anymore that what he felt for her was just gratitude. Elena was quiet for a long time. The sun continued to set, and Theo continued to play, and somewhere in the garden a bird began to sing its evening song. When she finally turned to look at Marcus, her eyes were bright with tears that she wasn't shedding. She said that she had felt it too, almost from the beginning. The connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond the shared mission of helping Theo. She said that she had tried to ignore it, had told herself it was inappropriate, had reminded herself of all the reasons why it could never work. But watching him with his son these past months, seeing the way he was fighting to become a better man, she had realized that maybe some things were worth the risk. That maybe the best families weren't the ones that looked perfect from the outside, but the ones that were built by people who chose each other, despite everything. She said yes. Not to a relationship, not yet, because they both knew that this needed to unfold slowly, carefully, for Theo's sake as much as their own. But yes to the possibility. Yes to seeing where this could go. Yes to letting Marcus Kane into her heart. This man who had terrified her when she first arrived, and now made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. Marcus took her hand, gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. They sat there together, as the last light faded from the sky, watching Theo chase his ball across the grass, two broken people beginning to imagine what it might feel like to be whole. A year later, they were married in that same garden, with Theo as the ring-bearer. The boy walked down the aisle without his crutches, something the doctors had said might never happen, something that Elena's patience and Marcus's love and the simple miracle of healing had made possible. He carried the rings on a small pillow, his steps careful but confident, and when he reached his father, he smiled and said a sentence that made everyone in attendance cry. He said that his daddy was getting married to Elena, and that meant they were going to be a family forever. Marcus had spent his life building an empire of fear and shadows, but standing in that garden with his son beside him and his bride walking toward him, he realized that the only empire worth having was this one. A family, their home, a love that he had never expected to find and would never take for granted. He had come home early that day, 3 months earlier, expecting to find thieves and betrayers. Instead, he had found his son laughing for the first time in 2 years, a woman drawing elephants in the dirt, and a chance at a life he had stopped believing was possible. Some people would call it luck. Marcus knew better. It was grace, the kind that finds us when we least deserve it and most need it, and he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for it. If this story reminded you that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, and that healing happens when we least expect it, then leave a small sign of your presence. A heart, a like, a quiet gesture to say that these words found their way to you. because every story deserves to be witnessed, and every family that finds its way back to each other deserves to be celebrated. And maybe, just maybe, someone you know needs to hear that it's never too late to start again.